Hello, writer friends. This workshop for Book Marketing Pro Academy is the first of a series that I'm calling the editing series. We have all these wonderful editors who help make our writing better, the content level editors, the line editors, the copy editors, and the proofreaders. And they all have very much needed purposes and tasks that they take care of for us and make us look good. So the first in this series of 4 is going to be about content editing. So the content editor is also sometimes called a developmental editor or a substantive editor. This person is looking for the big ideas of the book. I'm going to call her she. She has read the proposal. She understands the overall thrust of the book. She's read a summary of some kind, perhaps some marketing copy that you've helped create in terms of understanding what the book is going to be about. And so she has that big picture idea to help you shape those ideas in a focused kind of a way, so that there is structure to your book, there's clear flow, there's clarity. And this happens before, and this isn't a line by line editing yet. That next editor is called the line editor, but this editor is looking for big kind of structural ways that the book can be improved. And it makes the book so much better when we start with a substantive kind of an edit right from the beginning. So this person's role again will be looking for those big kind of ideas. She might ask you to reorder the chapters. She might ask you to add some chapters. She might ask you to condense the book and give you ways that you can do that. Sometimes we overwrite and we have too many words, where really the better ideas that we have are getting lost in those words somehow. So this editor looks at that big kind of a picture and helps us kind of hone it down in the best way that it will appeal to the reader. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do, I think I've talked about that already, what the content editor does. So we can go to the next slide. The first thing that this editor is going to do is assess the overall manuscript. They're going to evaluate right from the get-go whether this is a strong book, whether it's marketable, whether it's compelling for the intended audience, where they're going to offer suggestions to sharpen or kind of reposition some of the material in the book if necessary. They will also decide whether the length is appropriate. This first read, when you are working with traditional or a hybrid publisher, this first read is really important because they're making the decision. Yeah, this book is substantive. It's good. The writing is strong. And sometimes when you're working with a traditional publisher, they decide, are you going to get your advance money on your contract or not? They're going to give that first approval. So sometimes some of the advance is given on the signing, some of the advance is given when you turn the manuscript in, and the rest of the advance is given when the final manuscript is approved. So they're doing first an overall assessment in terms of its strength and its marketability mostly. They will also want to go through the book, read it. They'll read it. They're going to ensure that the book actually is speaking to that intended reader that you identified in your proposal. They would suggest tone or style kinds of changes or kind of anecdotes that could appeal to that audience. For example, if you indicated in your proposal that there was going to be kind of a humorous, lighthearted tone, and then you have various chapters in your book that are very serious in nature, that's going to be off target for what you actually had promised the reader with your title, subtitle, and with some of the hook that you've written for your book. So they want to make sure that that language is also at the right level. So in terms of readability for that target audience. So if you were writing a novel for young adults, for example, so that means like high school age kids and younger. That would mean that you have to think about the vocabulary. It's going to be a little different. And then if you're writing for middle grades, it's going to be a little different. So they're going to make those kinds of assessments as well. The content editor will also help strengthen the book's hook and purpose. They assess the introduction, the opening chapters, the overall pitch of the book to confirm that the book is actually going to grab attention quickly and establish the purpose for the book. So sometimes, maybe you're writing a narrative, you're writing a memoir, you're writing a novel, and just the beginning, the first chapter of it is just not grabbing anybody. Maybe it's not strong enough with conflict to draw that reader in. So that content editor would make suggestions about how you might make those kinds of changes. And then and with nonfiction, if the content editor reads your book and maybe they don't feel like you're zoning in on the reader's problems quickly enough. Maybe there's too much of, your story there, and there's not a kind of a universal appeal to the overall reader for your book. They'll make those kinds of suggestions as well. So the content editor will also evaluate the structure and organization of the book. They'll look at the manuscript's flow in terms of chapters and sections, or rather sections of the book and chapters, and then headings within those chapters to ensure that ideas progress logically and build on each other without redundancy or gaps. So we go into our writing thinking that we're using largely a lot of our example to make an idea, to make a point of some kind. But perhaps the experience that we have doesn't necessarily represent what is the most logical flow to the way a book should be organized. So the content editor could pick up on that and suggest some major kinds of structural changes. I experienced that with my book that came out last year, Praying Personalities, Finding Your Natural Prayer Style. So there's the first third of the book is about the different ways that biblical people prayed. And the way that I organized those chapters was that I put them in terms I started at the beginning, because that seemed logical to me to kind of use a chronology through the Bible. So starting with Adam, and then moving later to Jesus and Paul. And my the content editor on that project said, "No, Jan, what people really want to see is what kinds of personalities or kind of praying styles where you actually seeing these people. So bring them, find those, and then create new chapters and then make some statement about what you're seeing, about how their personality affected their praying style." That was a huge piece of organization that I had to redo. So that took a chunk of time. And one thing is that, when we are on deadlines, it's really, really important to meet those deadlines, that initial deadline in terms of turning in our manuscript, because publishers establish their scheduling based on those kinds of deadlines. They will line up all these editors one after the other, down to the proofreaders, to make sure that they, can attack that book and get it edited on a certain schedule. So that meant that Janet had to do a lot of work and dig in and find those and cut and paste and reorganize that first third of the book, which was pretty challenging. And at first I had some resistance points about it, but then I thought, but as I began working through it, I'm like, this really makes sense. It really does. And I think it will help the reader kind of relate more personally to these biblical people. Okay, the next thing that a content editor will do is be to identify gaps in content. I think that if we're writing nonfiction, often um, we understand a concept, we understand what we've learned, we understand what a biblical passage might mean, but the reader may not. So we have to do the tough job in terms of explain to that reader. That was something that I experienced with the book Prayer Walk. I worked with Liz Haney, who's an excellent content editor, one of the finest in the industry. And she kept telling me, what does this mean? Tell me more, explain this. So that was where I learned the idea of explain. What does something mean? And how does this relate to me? How can I apply it to my life? To think through those kinds of things instead of just sort of plopping ideas in and then leaving them there for the reader to kind of wrestle with and figure out on her own. We do the wrestling for the reader in terms of that teaching point. With the narratives, there may be some backstory that needs to be told about a character so that the reader understands their motivation for saying something or doing something or having some kind of an opinion. So those different ways that the content editor can help us fully develop a book so that there aren't those gaps in the content. They also may ask us to make cuts or condensation. Um, they may feel that a chapter isn't pertinent to this book and ask you to remove it. They may feel that you need to elaborate a little bit more about something. They may ask you to condense some material. An example of that might be, say, you have a 12 chapter book and your chapters are generally, between 12, 15 pages, something like that. And then you have a chapter that's 25 pages. That doesn't need to be. I know I edit Bible studies for a publisher, and there's one writer who she writes a lot. I'll just say that she writes a lot, and sometimes she'll ask the reader to look up this verse and then tell them what it means, and look up that verse and tell what it means, look up this verse and tell what it means. When all of those questions basically are the same question. And so a lot of that, I would, simply ask the writer just to condense a lot of that. If it's repetitive, it's already been said. We don't necessarily need to repeat the same thing over and over again. It's a little bit different than explain, because explain. This is Janet's terminology. Means, what does something say? What does it mean? And how does it apply to me? So those are important pieces in nonfiction. I think it's really important to respect that editor's eyes. That they can often see things that we just can't simply see ourselves. Okay, the eighth thing would be that content editors enhance the clarity of the message. Sometimes as we're writing along, particularly if we've dragged this book out a year, 2 years, 3 years, we worked on it forever. And perhaps sometimes as writers, we lose sight of the focus and the purpose of the overall book. And so we're adding all this other kind of stuff that really, might be off topic. So the content editor will make comments to make sure that the reader is staying on thesis, that the theme remains strong and clear all the way throughout, and that any of the supporting material and examples actually hold those thematic ideas up. She will also make sure that the goals are clear for the reader, because we don't want to lose the reader 2-3 chapters into the book. We want to keep her reading on. A ninth point of task of the content editor would be that she will help strengthen the chapter openings and closings. Sometimes writers have a tough time, beginning a chapter or not knowing what they say at the end. Haven't they said everything? Do I just reword what I've said? No, at the beginning of the chapter, you're probably starting anecdotally. You're bringing the reader in. You're addressing an issue of some kind in an engaging way, and then you're going to provide some helpful points to them. By the end of the chapter, then you are providing additional kind of coaching for the reader. You're providing some next steps for them. You're providing some help for them to help them move forward with the struggle that they are having. So this kind of editor can just overall, and she probably wouldn't say this like, okay, for chapter 12, do this, chapter 13, do this, she might just give an overall instruction that says, I've shown you in chapter 2 what I think will add, to strengthen your opening and your closing in the chapter. Now, what I want you to do is to go do the same for the rest of the chapters. So that I think that's an excellent way that this content editor can coach. Or some might just say, "Hey, strengthen the openings and closings," depending on kind of their editing style. They will also kind of evaluate the overall pacing of the book. They'll assess whether the sections move too slowly or too quickly. They might recommend adjustments for reader engagement. I know that some writers, some chapters might end up being like very anecdotal in nature. And then some chapters might be more didactic, like the information is just poured at you, poured at you, poured at you. And it gets kind of hard to take in. Maybe we need some more supporting stories or examples, things like that. So they'll look at that kind of pacing. So, for example, if it's a Christian living book, as you're making several points, several important kind of thematic ideas in a chapter, are you bringing an example? Are you making an analogy of some kind or an example from your life or someone else's, so that we can begin to see those ideas? The reader can see those ideas there. So they'll look for that kind of pacing. Is this what this writer does? A good content editor will help a writer improve her voice and tone. They help the author refine the writing style to match the audience, whether that's warm and conversational, professional and authoritative, or narrative and lyrical in nature. That's like poetic. So they can do a quick read on this writer, reading a chapter or two and seeing if that voice, if that tone is actually holding up all the way through the book, or is there a switch of some kind, and why did that happen? That I think that's really important as well, and that helps us develop as writers. Someone once said, and I don't know who this was, but that a good writer is a rewriter. I mean, anybody can put words down. Anybody can. But a good writer, pays attention to this editorial direction, and then, really works hard at making the improvements that need to be done. So the book is readable, and so it's helpful to people too. Um, there are certain expectations that readers will have when they go into a genre. If it's a devotional book, they will probably have the expectation that there's going to be a scripture. There probably is a little anecdotal entry. There's a teaching portion. There's an application portion and a prayer. That's very typical. That's kind of standard for a devotional. If you're calling it a devotional book, but there's absolutely no Bible teaching at all on the verse that you provided to the reader, that might be disappointing for them. That might not be exactly what they expected to get out of the book. So that's just, one example. And, every genre is going to have sort of, it has a style, it has a form. And so I think it's important, even before we start reading, to kind of look at some good examples, those mentor books, as I call them, in that particular genre, so we can get the hang. I'm like, what do these actually look like? Look at some good writers' writings in the kind of genre that you want to write, and then you're not copying their thoughts, but you're just thinking, I'm like, oh, I see that this writer does this. I like that style. It's good. Choose those successful books as models for you. The content editor will also kind of enhance the consistency of ideas all the way through. They'll make sure that keywords, key terms, metaphors, theological ideas, philosophical ideas, thematic concepts are used consistently throughout. In the book, let me grab it. My book about Jesus prayer teachings. It's the complete guide to the prayers of Jesus. So at the beginning, I had thought I would, because I call Jesus my personal trainer, because that's how I've learned to pray. I've just kind of studied his prayer life a lot. So I thought, I'm just going to use that same kind of example I've always used with the prayer walking stuff that I've done. And my editor said, "Nah, that's those books. Let's not do that anymore." And then she said, "What about Jesus is your teacher?" She says, "You're a teacher. Could you bring some examples, stories from your teaching life that what you could use as you write this book?" That was perfect, really, because he is also my mentor in prayer. And that was kind of the vision for that. So that was really kind of that helped me, begin to think about, how was I going to develop those examples throughout the rest of the chapters. So they might do that. They might think of that thread or that metaphor that you're going to weave throughout your book in some kind of way. They can challenge you in terms of theological content as well. I have that as a point later on. Let's see. I do. I'll talk about that a little later. Okay. So we can go to 14. Yeah. So with fiction or memoir, they would evaluate characterization. They'll help authors ensure characters are believable, compelling, consistent in terms of how they behave based on what we know about them, their motivations, their flaws, their strengths. And they'll help you also kind of create that growth arc where we're seeing the character come from a place of weakness and grow as a character in some way, as manifested through the external problems there. So they'll help coach you in terms of developing character. And if it's memoir, of course, that's you. If that's fiction, it'll be the various characters that you create. And the next slide is relates to that. They'll also kind of assess this idea of world building. So yeah, when we're writing memoir, our world, we live in our world. I've lived in this house 44 years. So if I were writing, if my setting took place in this home a lot, I would have to like create that world. And it's not as though I've created it from scratch because it's here. It's a matter of just noting details of rooms and places like that and giving a sense of the overall feel of the home. So we do that whether that is nonfiction or nonfiction memoir or biography, or whether it's fiction. We're like creating a world, actually creating a world there. So we need enough detail. We need enough sense of where people are and what the surroundings look like. And it's pretty challenging to do that in a way that is more show rather than tell, but it can be done. Notice how writers do that well. They also will ensure the nonfiction book has a practical it has practical takeaways for the readers instead of talking like all this theory, this theology, like how do we live that? Because bottom line, that's why someone's going to pick up a nonfiction book. They're looking for transformation. They're looking for change. So, in such a way, in these self-help kind of books or devotional books, even Bible studies, we want to make sure that the teaching points are actionable and that they're supported by examples and they're actually relevant to the reader's life. Content editors will also provide research and fact checking kinds of suggestions, as well as a theological review. So, what happens here? So, editing is a hard job because often writers will cite other writers who have things in print, and not necessarily get the quotes correctly. They may just find a quote on some image that they've seen online somewhere, which maybe that's been taken out of context. Maybe it's not completely correct. The wording has been switched around. So it's the editor's really tough job to either kind of look that up. And when I've done that kind of editing, I do my best to try to find it, and often some of the books I have on hand and I can go check that out. But to make sure that they are correct and that the people are represented correctly, but also that that person is theologically sound. And that can be kind of tricky. I mean, because there are, I can think of a couple authors that when I wanted to use some of their material, and then when I went into their biographies and found out like what happened to them later in life, I'm like, maybe that's not the best kind of example that I could use here. I'll find something else. So I have like reliable kinds of works on my shelves, and people I know I can trust. I keep those books handy so I can cite pages and know that I have the citation correctly. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But there will be these fact checking kind of suggestions. And if I can't find it and validate that quote, then I will ask the writer to do that and provide evidence to me. They will, so the content editor will flag these areas that kind of need stronger sources, scriptural references, updated research, and then they're also making sure that this material is cited. So anything that comes from another source, even if it's just an idea, not an exact quote, there's a complete citation for that. And in publishing, we use the Chicago Manual of Style for the end notes or the chapter notes or the end notes or footnotes, whichever way the publisher wants to handle that. The way that's done, but it's Chicago style. So it's good to invest in that book. There is a brand new version out, I think version 18. Okay. Oh, back to 17 too. You might find that your content editor is checking your theology. And I found that to be true with my devotional book, Looking Up. There were some points of theology because it's a 365-day devotional book. So 365 teachings I was doing on the Bible. And thank the Lord for these kinds of people who would challenge me. And because my publisher, Our Daily Bread, they stick very kind of literally to what the word says, so that I can make no assumptions. I can't say things like, Paul always felt that, or what God is thinking here is, those are red flags. We can't know what God is thinking. We can write about what he has said in his word, right? We same with other biblical people in the Bible, the writers of the Bible. We can't say what someone thought or what their motivation was, or unless we can find that in the text. So be very careful of that kind of use of the Bible, and be thankful for really strong editors who hold you to that kind of teaching to be, so that your teaching is strong and validated. They can help you also improve the use of illustrations or stories. They might advise on where stories, analogies, case studies, or examples will better illustrate points. I had one of my editors who 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 was she read deeply in the area of prayer, and so she could point me to specific kinds of classic writers on prayer, to help me just kind of develop, not only as a writer, but as a person who was really intrigued with the idea of prayer. So that really can be helpful to not only make your book better, but to make you better as a student of God's word. Um, they would advise on the length and the market fit of your book. Um, maybe at some point, again, maybe you've turned in a manuscript that's way too long for that particular genre. Christian living, you're looking at 45,000 to 60,000 words. Okay, maybe your Bible study is a little sketchy. It's too short. It's not going to have any kind of spine sitting on a shelf. So they may ask you to kind of to develop something, so that it fits the market better. They may also ask you to make these sections or chapter reordering. I discussed this a little bit earlier. Maybe restructuring the table of contents for a better logical and emotional kind of impact for the reader. Next idea is that they will help strengthen the author's unique contributions. Um, Good editors will want you to open up as a writer and to be vulnerable, to really lay out your struggles there. I edited one book where I felt like um, the writer's struggles were too vague. She wasn't being it wasn't as though you're really sitting by her side and hearing her story. She spoke in vague generalities. So that could be something that that an editor could do. They'll help the author highlight what makes their voice, their story, or their teaching different from others in the market. They may also help address any kind of legal concerns or permissions if you have used chunks of quoted material from another writer, another source, such that the editor decides that really needs permission. It's like someone's chunk of an idea. It's what their mission or their whole process is. We can't use that without permission. And so typically your initial manuscript would have to be turned in with those permissions from the legal departments of the other publishing houses where you've gotten that information. So yeah, make sure that if you have those kinds of chunks, not a single little quotes. No, you don't need permission for that. That's kind of in fair use. But if you're taking like a substantive idea, like I wrote a book called Prayer Changes Teens, How to Parent from Your Knees. I had umpteen permissions in that because with every chapter, I found these really like gems of teaching about how to parent teenagers from other sources. I read 50 books on parenting. It was an insane season of my life. And I had to get permissions for all of those pieces that I used, because they were like telling you like how do you talk to your child about drug use, things like that. And so that was a chunk of their teaching that I had to get permissions for. So you write to the legal department of the publishing house, not to the author directly unless it is self-published. Okay, so then how is this information conveyed to the author? I'm like, how does this happen in a practical kind of way? This content editor is not going to rework your manuscript. This content editor is going to do one of a couple things or maybe both. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So she might provide editorial remarks and margin notes using track changes. Word has the feature, and we submit our manuscripts in Microsoft Word. Word has the a track changes feature, and you'll find that when track changes are given to you with feedback from your editors, that you will go over to your very right hand side. I'm not sure which way I'm looking at, your right hand side, and you'll find these remarks there. Like the editor might say, you're finding your manuscript's probably not marked up, but the content editor, maybe in track changes, might say, I don't think this example works here. Can you think of another one? Or another page. He might say, you are repeating, this is redundant. You're repeating an idea you've already said. Just some general direction like that. So instead of finding all those editorial changes, in red on your manuscript, you're going to find those perhaps in the margins there. And then the other way is perhaps in addition to or instead of, you might find that this content editor simply writes you a letter. And this would be an email with point one. What does she want you to do? She wants you to, number one, reorder the chapters to end such and such a way. And then she might say, and number two is, I think you need to develop a symbolic, metaphorical kind of thread that will carry the reader from chapter to chapter. What could that be? Here are some ideas. So those might be those general kinds of reorganizational kinds of suggestions that you would find in a letter. And then what does this content editor continue to do? So you have done all these wonderful things that the editor has asked you to do. You send it back to that editor. And then that editor runs through again to make sure that those changes happened. And if the changes didn't happen, then that editor may be calling you or sending you an email saying, I suggested this, you really need to do this. Let's get that done. If you have questions, let's have a conversation. So you keep working with that content editor. Probably there's maybe another round. You might find there's another round with the content editor that you have to go through. And this is why it takes longer to have a really good book put into print. Other roles that you might find that a content editor does is to help kind of even prepare a book proposal. So, and that may be on your own book at that point. But if you find that you've created a book that a publisher has loved and readers want more, that then you begin maybe having conversations with that content editor, not the other editors down the line, but that content editor who has kind of taken some ownership over the mastery of this wonderful book. And then she says, what's your next book? And I'm like, I don't know. What do you think? And often those editors have really a good sense of what's happening in the market. They see what's out there. They understand the genre you're writing. They understand the particular kind of focus of your book, whether it's on prayer or parenting or marriage or whatever it is. And they might understand some holes and be able to suggest the next title. Which is that's something that occurred to me after I wrote Prayer Walk. And so I worked on 4 different books with the same editor. And every time we began to have this conversation. Now I did all the proposal suggestions there, but we did have some back and forth, either via email or a phone conversation about, what that next idea could be. So yeah, I think the biggest idea that we get through this is that we really become better writers through the process of rewriting. As I said earlier, anybody can put words down, but we can become stronger in our craft to a point where um, the ideas just begin coming, and you have a better sense of how a book can be put together. You have more confidence. You yourself have antenna up as to what's going on in the industry. And I think it's the relationship, particularly with this level of editing, the developmental editor, the content editor, this editor who has the big idea kind of approach that it really can help foster that excellence in a new writer. So I encourage you to take those suggestions seriously. And then, sometimes you might feel like, no, that's not what my book is, or no, that's not what I wanted to say, or no, that's not what I wanted to write, or, you know, um, instead listen. And then if your editor has made some significant suggestions, then just say, that's so interesting. Why do you think that's a better approach? And that's a really kind of friendly way to develop relationships in the industry and learn how to be better. I think we go into an idea with a book like, it's going to be all about our experience or whatever. We can grow in terms of our maturity, our spiritual maturity, as well as our writing maturity by working with a content editor who challenges us. Don't be afraid of that challenge. The challenges are really going to make us stronger as a whole. So Kathy is here, and just looking in the comments. Hello to you. Um, Kathy says, thanks so much for detailed example. We'll take it to heart when writing the 2, maybe 3 books in my heart. I'm glad that you have at least 2 or 3. So blessings on your day. Again, if you have questions, you can put them up on the Facebook page, and I'd be happy to help you with that.